Hey guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to Tactical Bassin. Today we are talking about spring crankbait fishing. From mid-depth divers to the biggest of squarebills, everywhere in between. We're going to talk about what makes a crankbait so effective for spring bass fishing, how to use it to your advantage during the pre-spawn, and the different baits, colors, and styles that will put fish in the boat consistently. What we're doing today is actually rolling a handful of videos all up into one. We're going to do an overview of a bunch of different kinds of baits. The only thing we're not going to focus on today is lipless cranks. And lipless are a huge part of spring bass fishing, but Tim has done an awesome job of covering that in a video that you'll see here in just a few days. So I'm staying away from that. We're going to focus on all the rest. Deep divers, mid divers, little squarebills, all the way up to Magnum size baits. How to take a crankbait and implement it into your spring fishing. This has already been the year of the crankbait. You guys know that from the release of our bait on, we have cranked or talked to you about cranking or shown you how to do it so many different times because it is so unbelievably effective. So we've already covered a lot of that, but with spring coming, there are some adaptations in both the styles of baits, where to throw them, and colors that I really want to walk you guys through. So we'll keep it super brief on the deep cranks because we've been covering this since fall. So 3 different styles of deep cranks. The one Tim and I built, the Tactical DD, Megabass Deep X 300, Megabass Deep 6. There they are all together, just a little size comparison for you. The Deep X 300 being the smallest, then the Tactical, then the Deep 6. All dynamite baits, all tight action baits. Their purposes are a little bit different, but those are all proven baits in cold water going into the spring. They work phenomenally as those fish are stacking up on that outside cover, working secondary points, moving in. But we've talked about it enough that that's all we're going to say on it in this video. I think you already know how to do it. If you don't, down in the video description, I'll link you a couple of our other crankbait videos that took that to a whole different level, walking you through exactly how to do it and catching fish while we were talking about it to really get you up to speed. So with that in mind, let's focus on what to do as the fish get shallower. Because we've already talked about where these fish go in the spring, where they go during the pre-spawn, how they're making that transition towards spawning areas, but they're not actually there yet. They're making the shift. They're following secondary points in. They're hopping offshore structures. It depends on the style of lake. We've already covered all that. So if your fish are still sitting a little bit farther out, that's where the mid diver comes in. And the mid diver is something that I throw a lot in the springtime, and then I kind of get away from it. I don't throw them a whole lot the rest of the year. Occasionally I'll get on a summer bite with a mid diver, but really it shines in the spring. Couple of baits here. Spro Rock Crawler. Now that one works all winter long and continues to hammer going through the spring. The Rock Crawler, what I like about this bait is how well it does, well, the name, rock crawler. That bait does unbelievably bouncing off of cover, deflecting on rocks, kicking and moving. Not so much a bait that I like in open water. It's a bait that I like contacting the bottom. So as your fish stage up, they move up. If you've got them in that, say, 5 to 10 foot depth range, and those fish are, especially if they're up against rock, if they're on rock or anything that you can bounce your way through, that bait will absolutely catch those fish. It does a really good job. Just like what we've been doing all winter, you want to fish it really fast, really aggressive, and stop and go. So what I mean by that is burn, 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 burn. When you bang into something, pause and let that bait, it'll be flying through the water and it'll just stop and start to back up out of there. That's when those fish will hit it. So crank, 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 pause. Crank, crank, pause. Crank, 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 pause. That's how you get that reaction strike. Another one in that same category that does an awesome job is the 3XD, a Strike King bait. The 3XD has caught some really, really nice fish for me in the pre-spawn. Has been, again, a very consistent producer. Last, for a budget guy, another bait that is just consistent throughout the spring. It's not as tight actioned as the winter baits. It's not a bait I throw in the winter. But as water temps are rising, you know, we're down in the 30s and 40s throughout the country. That water will start warming up. It'll get into the 50s, ultimately into the 60s. As you approach low to mid 60s, the fish start spawning. Once you break out of the 50s, a lot of that really narrow stuff goes away. So what I mean by that is, in the middle of winter, we are so specific about the action of our deep crank. We go out and throw our crank. That's what we throw because it's designed for that. Well, as the water warms up, the actions start to have a lot more wiggle room. The fish will eat tight action, they'll eat wider actions. They just get more aggressive. When it gets really warm, they love those wide, hard-moving actions. So, as that water's warming, as you get into the upper 50s and beyond, this little guy does great things. This is the Norman Deep Little N, the DLN. This little bait is inexpensive and flat out catches them. We've done videos with it in the past. Again, if your water's still really cold, not the perfect choice, but as it starts to warm, that's a dynamite option and it's not going to cost you a fortune. It'll do a really good job right along with these other two. So that's your mid divers. Let's jump into even shallower than that. Let's talk about squarebills. Now there are other baits that will play in that really shallow category, but for me, once you're shallow, the squarebill is where it's at. So I've told you before, my favorite squarebill is the biggie. That guy right there. It's got a good heavy sound to it. It's got a nice knock, and I love to throw it in that red. And I'm gonna circle back on color. We're going to talk in detail about color here in just a minute, but the biggie is one of my favorite baits. It's a good size, phenomenal action, great sound, and comes stocked with really solid hooks, so I'm not afraid to stick big fish on it. It comes with size 2 treble hooks. That's a big treble on a crankbait, especially on a squarebill. It does a really good job. Another one in that same size range that we've got to talk about is the Sixth Sense. Again, a bait with a lot of sound. What I like so much about the Sixth Sense is that it comes, again, with really good hardware. It comes with that EWG style hardware, tipped in points, and it comes in some dynamite colors. Really, really good color options. So both play very well. Again, this is my favorite, hands down, but last year I really put some time into this bait, and I can't deny how effective it was as well. And again, down in the video description, we'll link all of them. Now for a size comparison, going to a smaller bait, because these are both in that, let's call it a 2.5 size. Going a little smaller, this is a Lucky Craft 1.5. See, it's just a little bit smaller all the way around than the other two baits. The 1.5 is also silent, dead silent. If the going gets tough, if there's boat pressure, those fish are shallow and the water's really clear, there's a lot of reasons to do it, but turning to a silent bait can get a really good bite. I like those rattling baits because they're consistent, they have great drawing power, they'll pull fish a long ways, but sometimes they just want that silent bait and you need to be prepared to throw it. Last but not least, this truly isn't even a squarebill, but I'm still putting it in the same category. The Spro Little John. This little guy with its computer board lip. See, it's not a true square bill. It's got a rounded end to it, but it plays in that same category. It's a shallow diver. It's a true flat-sided crankbait, so it's got a very different action to it, and it does have a knocker, and it's got a single ball, but it's a tungsten ball, and it has a very low, very dull sound. I don't even know if you'll hear it, but it does have a knock to it. but it's really dull. This is another major fish producer when those bass first go shallow. They first make that move up into the shallows, but the water is still cold. This one is dynamite. I actually throw this one before I throw the biggie. When the water gets a little bit warmer, I put this away and out comes the biggie. But between them, notice the color, I can get a lot done with those baits. And that's just another color sample. In fact, let's stop right here and talk color, then we'll talk about the bigger baits. All right, now let's talk about color. In general, I have a very, very simple system that I use for colors on all my hard baits, and we've talked about this a lot. Essentially, you need three things. You need something bold, you need something flashy, and you need something clear. And what I mean by that, bold is typically going to be a white, something like a chartreuse shad. Something like this would work. You can also sub in a chartreuse, a bright, bold, flashy, well, not flashy, but a very bold color. For reflective, something shiny, chromes or scale pattern baits, something like golden shiner, perfect example. Very flashy, reflective bait, something with some scales, another great choice. And then something clear or ghost, a ghost minnow or something to that effect. That will get me through almost every situation anywhere in this country, with the exception of the early spring. In the early spring, in comes red. Notice how many of these baits that I picked up are red. I think you're getting the picture. Even in our own bait, we only came out with a handful of very cold water, very specific colors. It was very important to Tim and I that a true red and brown was included in that. So, what's the deal with red? Pre-spawn, bass love crawfish. As we're first coming out of that cold water, before we ever get to the actual spawn, they are mowing down crawdads. They also are just plain feeding aggressively. They need to eat. They need to bulk up. And red is a deadly effective color for that time frame. My actual favorite is that ghost red. In a perfect world, it's the exact color that we built, which is, if I could separate these, come on. That ghost red side, the brown and orange on the back. That is our perfect color. But that ghost black does a dynamite job too. Any of those clear reds are just incredible. That is where my confidence lies. When I go out and those fish have started to move up, they're making the shift. I know it's truly the pre-spawn now. I always start with red. And when I start with red, I always start with those ghost iridescent see-through reds. The only time that I go to those bold colors is when I have bad water quality. So if all of a sudden storms come in or something like that, and you start getting that muddy water dumping in, you lose the clarity, then I go to the Delta Craw type colors. Delta Craw is going to be that red mixed with a bright orange, that day glow orange. That combination has the exact same effect when you don't have good clarity. But if you've got the clarity, that ghost red is where it's at. So color, again, really simple. Most of the year, 3 styles. Springtime, add in the 4th, and I actually put the bulk of my attention to that 4th, to the red. 2 more styles of baits. We're going to talk about the bigger baits, bigger squarebills specifically. Now, a couple of years ago, you had to jump from a standard squarebill all the way to the Magnums. But now, there's an in-between. There's several of them. This is the Lucky Craft BDS 6. This is the 6th Sense Mini Mag. Fairly similar. The Lucky Craft is a little bit bigger. Both much, much larger than say a 1.5. You should see this pile of baits I have here next to me. I'm just picking them up and dropping them as I go. 1.5, whoop, BDS 6. Huge size difference. But the jump from a BDS 6 to a Magnum, also a huge size difference. This is a fantastic in-between size. Both of these baits absolutely smashed for Tim and I this year. Both of them are great options. The Sixth Sense comes in a ton of amazing colors and comes with fantastic EWG style hardware already on it. Open the package, go fishing. It's a dynamite bait. The Lucky Craft, a lot more limited on colors. This is actually my favorite, the Golden Shiner color. I also changed the hardware. I take these hooks and get rid of them, replace them with Owner ST56, size 2. And again, down in the video description, I'll link all of it. You don't have to try and remember this stuff. It's a little more of a pain to get this bait ready for battle with a big fish, but it's worth it. There's a reason we're going through that. We caught giants on this bait last year. That in between is awesome. It has way more options and way more times when I want to throw it than the true giant baits. Now that said, there's a time and a place for the giants as well. Again, Lucky Craft and Sixth Sense. Those are the two that have stepped up to the table with those giant squarebills. The Sixth Sense comes in rattling as well as silent. The Lucky Craft just comes in silent. Big bait, huge hardware. Now, even though they are squarebills, they get deep. That's what makes these baits so interesting, because you can cover a huge spectrum. It's a squarebill. It'll bounce and deflect off cover, so you can fish it shallow, but you can fish it all the way down deep for those pre-spawn fish. Now, why throw a bait of this size? In the past, we actually did a dedicated video just to baits of this size in the spring. Now, if you're a pond guy or a bank fisherman, this would be a tough bait for you because they want to get down and dig. You'd be on bottom getting hung up a lot. But if you're on a boat and you're on a lake where your bass eat larger bait, they chase gizzard shad, tilapia, bluegill, crappie, any of those larger bait fish, that giant squarebill has a place in the springtime. When the fish get serious about eating those bigger meals, these baits flat out catch them. It's almost like swim bait fishing, only you can cover a ton of water and you can draw that reaction strike very, very easily. There's absolutely a place for this in the arsenal. If that scenario doesn't describe you and you just want to catch a bigger fish, that's where those in-betweener baits, the BDS 6 and the Mini Mag, just shine so bright over the smaller traditional offerings. Now, I know we've covered a ton of stuff here and I'm about to talk gear, but again, I'll break down all of it in the video description, every bait, and I'll give you, for those 4 different color styles, I'll give you my favorites in every single one of these baits just to make it that much easier for you. Now, I'll try and keep rods and reels and that extremely simple. For line, I'm either fishing straight fluorocarbon. On any of the normal size baits, I'm using 12 pound. On the giant Magnum baits, I'm using 15 pound. A lot of people throw bigger than that. I don't. I think 15 will do a fine job, especially on a proper crankbait rod that helps absorb shock. For the rods and reels, the IMX Pro 845 CBR. Same rod that we squarebill on, we throw the lipless on, we throw our crankbait on. We do so many different things with the exact same rod. It does an amazing job. I love this rod because it's a crankbait rod, super soft in the tip section, and then that taper just grows and you finally get some power down in the butt. So the same rod can throw this bait and this little tiny bait, because it depends on how deep you load that rod up. It's a 7-foot rod paired up with fluorocarbon. It does an amazing job. You can also, again, pair it up with braid to leader. With braid to leader, I like 20-pound braid to 12-pound leader. And for that leader, I go with Maxima Ultra Green. It's mono, it's stretchier. It helps. It's a shock absorber. It's just one more thing that will help give, because braided line is incredible for getting that stop and go retrieve, for feeling what kind of cover you're on the bottom. Are you banging rocks? Are you banging wood? Is that mud? It really helps with all that. And then when you stop, the bait stops. There's no stretch. The downside is that when you hook up, you've got a big fish on little trebles on braided line. That's where that shock absorbing leader and that really limber rod make a huge difference. The other one that we really like, this is a 906. The 845, that's a 7-foot rod. This is a 7.5. It's a 7'6" rod. Other than that, taper-wise, extremely similar. If you're going braid to leader, I prefer the 7.6 because it's just that much more give. If you're staying fluoro, either one will work great, but I do love that 845. Now, one nice thing, that IMX Pro is incredibly sensitive for a crankbait rod. If you need to save some money, one place where you can save it, they offer the exact same model, that 845 CB in the E6X series, and it's quite a bit less money. Not as sensitive as the IMX Pro, but not as pricey either, so a great balance there. The only other rod that I would talk about is for the true giant baits. The rod that I love for them is the same rod that we do all of our deep cranking on in the summer. The rod we throw a DD22, a 6XD, a 10XD, the big Azumas, and the big Squarebills, is that Shimano Zodius 7'6" glass rod. That is an interesting rod. It's 7.5 footer, much stouter than this 906, so it'll handle those giant baits, but it does an amazing job with a parabolic action of keeping those fish pinned. So that's the rod. Again, these rods, you can throw your lipless, your Squarebills, all these different mid-size baits. The other one, the Zodius, you could throw all the bigger crankbaits as well as the Magnum Squarebills, all the way down to that BDS 6 or that mini mag. They'll all throw great on that rod. So just a couple options, and again, we'll link all that. But guys, I know I covered a ton of stuff here, but if you really drum it down, you can keep it simple. As the fish move through the season, as they're moving up toward the spawn, we start with those deeper cranks. They're very cold water specific baits. As we get a little farther, we start switching over to our mid-depth divers. As they get up even shallower, we switch to our Squarebills. As the bait fish are making that same move into the shallows, you start seeing those bluegills, you start seeing crappie, you start seeing the larger bait fish showing up, you start going to those bigger baits. That's the transition, and you know your colors are simple. It's really not that complicated. Hopefully this helps you. This is the year of the crankbait. We've been having a ton of fun with it over the past few years. We're so glad that we get to pour all this information out for you. Now, I know we just covered a ton of videos in one, and I know that was a lot to take in, but we have so much to give you guys this spring. If we broke these out into individual videos, we'd run out of time. So I've lumped it all together. Hopefully you can break it down into manageable pieces for yourself. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, hit that bell symbol when you subscribe so that you know when new videos are coming, and we'll talk to you soon.